Hello and welcome to the channel. If you are new to this channel and perhaps you clicked on this video because of the clickbait title, and if you were expecting me to say all sorts of terrible things about the EU and to float various conspiracy theories, then I fear you may be a little bit disappointed because that is not my style. So yes, I have brought you here under false pretenses. Bad me, sorry, not sorry. But if you'll stick around, then I hope you might learn something interesting. Because what is my style is to talk about both sides of the argument. And regular viewers of my channel know that I do this quite often. And I do that quite deliberately for two reasons. One is, as a negotiator, you want to kind of understand the arguments that are going to be used by the other side so that you can develop your counters. But also, and here's a little bit of a secret life tip maybe, a properly confident individual, including very successful negotiators, are always willing to admit when the other side has made a good point. Because negotiations are not about just dismissing anything that the other side says. If they have said something really useful, really valid, really insightful, that should always be acknowledged. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree or you have to change your own position. But it is always important to acknowledge when a good argument has been made by the other side, because that is a very good technique and it demonstrates a level of intellectual confidence in the individual to argue their case when they can do that. Those who do not have that confidence just shout down even the valid points made by the opposition, which of course is pretty much politics in a nutshell these days. So when looking at the topic of the EU, there are many criticisms that can be levelled at the EU. And quite a few of those criticisms are actually valid. But the problem is that many people don't actually understand what lies underneath those criticisms, what it actually means. So in this video, I am going to draw upon my experience of having negotiated with EU negotiators and American ones as well. And I'm going to explain what those supposed criticisms or weaknesses of the EU means in a practical sense from a negotiation perspective. So in this video, I'm not going to really try and make any political argument. I'm going to try and explain this from a more from a more negotiation perspective, because that is what matters. That is the practicalities of what gets work done. What you see on TV and what you see in politicians saying bears very little resemblance to the actual reality of what happens. And not many people get to see the reality. So I think I'll take this opportunity to perhaps explain it in a little bit more detail, not a huge amount of detail because this is a massive topic, but at a rather high level, I'm going to try and run through some of the criticisms that you often hear about the EU and what that actually means in terms of how the EU operates. So for anyone new to this channel, I am the collaborative negotiator, professional negotiator of over 10 years of experience, handling all sorts of large negotiations. And for regular viewers in my channel, if you think I sound a bit funny, that is true. I do sound a bit funny. Just caught a cold coming out of it like everyone else seems to be. So I might croak a little bit like a frog. But sadly, no princesses kissing me will get any beautiful princes. So you'll just have to put up with the croakiness for the duration of this video, I'm afraid. So let's start with the most commonly heard and most frequent criticism of the EU. And that is that it has a huge, inefficient bureaucratic system, which is very slow, ponderous, and wastes lots of money. Now, by and large, this is true. This is very much the case that the EU bureaucratic system, it is enormous. It takes time to grind through things and to get things done. I'm going to compare that a little bit to the US, a sort of an equivalent level superpower, if you like, sort of. And in my experience, the US has equivalent levels of bureaucracy, not less. So smaller states, of course, tend to have less bureaucratic system. They have less people. This can give them the appearance of being more versatile, more agile, more responsive, because, of course, they're not having to crunch through those massive bureaucracies. However, from a negotiation perspective, my experience is that going up against the EU and the American negotiators, these are the toughest negotiators, government negotiators, you can ever go up against. And this is because they have that bureaucracy. Now, it can be frustrating because it can take a very long time to get any deal agreed, because they've got to get approved by their system. So there are, of course, several downsides. But for them, there's a massive upside in that they have a huge weight of institution behind them. And this is what I particularly want to flesh out today. Now, the first thing to highlight when talking about the EU is that we need to make a distinction between political bureaucracy versus their regulatory bureaucracy. And I want to make that distinction because it's a very different, this has nothing to do with how the EU is structured. This is all about how they operate in practice. So in a political sense, the EU has commissioners and various deputies and all that sort of thing, and they are drawn from all the nations that form the EU, 27 nations, and they try to balance it as much as possible. So each nation gets to, at some point or another, head up one of the commission departments. And not a very efficient process, far from it, but it's very much a European construct. It's there to give everybody a say. And what that, of course, does do, it creates a lot of political bureaucracy. And what that means is that whenever the Commission wants, or any other government, quite frankly, wants to adopt some kind of new policy, that policy has to be analysed. And people, I often say on this channel, there is no such thing as government policy that is truly black and white, that doesn't have trade-offs. So in the political sense, what the EU Commission bureaucracy is trying to do is to analyse every single aspect of any particular policy, drawing upon a wide range of people to fully establish the pros and cons. And it winds its way through the system, gets analysed by a whole bunch of different people. And by the time the developed policy goes back up to the head of the chain and says, this is our recommendation on what to do next, the idea is that just about every single individual in the EU, well, I'll exaggerate a little, has had the ability to input to that paper. It's a very slow, it's a very bureaucratic, it's a very consensual, collaborative type approach. But what it does do, and a popular phrase these days, is it introduces a diversity of views. So what that kind of means is that they're always open to different levels of thinking. So compare and contrast that perhaps with the US, which is a little bit more, a little bit less diverse. I know the US is a very diverse country, park that for now, but the US is not like 27 very different European states. So what that kind of means is that although they have the equivalent level of bureaucracy, those individuals in that bureaucratic system are subject more to institutional thinking. They tend to think alike, by and large. Of course, there's always exceptions, but by and large, they tend to think along similar lines. And while that can make them fairly effective in terms of bringing in expertise to analyse any particular political implication, it does mean that they are very reluctant to vary their thinking. Think of it as conservative with a small c, if you like. You're not going to get much radicalism out of the US government, that's for sure. Whereas in the EU Commission, you are definitely more likely to get radical thinking pop out, whether for good or for bad. Now, the other aspect of democracy I also wanted to mention, unsexy as it may be, is regulatory. The EU is described as a regulatory superpower, and for good reason. This is because the whole idea of the EU and the single market is that it will centralise all the bureaucracy for all 27 nation states. Now, that's not on every single issue. So there's stuff that the EU doesn't have any say over, particularly specific things like national security and defence and a few other factors. But on those things where the EU does have authority, the idea being is that they bring in any expert that they think is relevant on this particular issue. And the pool that the EU Commission can access is 27 different countries worth. So they have the ability to pick the best of the best from any country within that bloc. And that is what they try to do. So it does, of course, create a bit of a bloated system, because they might pick the best, for example, from France and Germany. And then they might also pick the best from Sweden or Italy or whatever on particular issues. So you get a bit of a duplication, if you like, of people. But here's where their true strength comes in. Because the whole point here is those 27 nations, if they ever need to analyse a new technology, let's say a new car engine, for sake of argument, nice and simple, the Germans are fond of this, and let's say they want to set the regulation for how much pollution that car engine is allowed to produce, the EU Commission would do all the analytical work using its access to all the best experts it's willing to pay lots of money for, and believe me, they pay lots of money. The end result, in theory of course, is the best type of regulation possible on that engine, on what it can and cannot do, what emissions it's allowed to do, recognising technical as well as other limitations. And the EU Commission will then codify that. It will be voted upon, and then that becomes EU law that has to be adopted by all 27 nations. Is this the most efficient and money well spent system in the world? No, it is not. Is it value for money? Oh, absolutely. This is because those 27 countries don't have to spend the money doing the same thing. They delegate it all to the EU, it's done there, and they just accept the result. So when during the Brexit debate the argument was made that the UK could repatriate £350 million per week back to the UK, spend it on the NHS or whatever other fallacy or false promise they wanted to promote, what those people completely ignored is that by coming out of that regulatory system, they would actually have to spend that £350 million per week to recreate the regulatory framework, to do the analysis, to do the law setting, to get buy-in expertise who would understand how a German engine works, for example, so that it can be allowed to legally pollute on UK roads. But of course that was not talked about, and that's not something that makes for exciting politics, so people don't talk about that. Now yes, you can make the argument that a single nation with a tight, well-run department without too many people can do the job and spend less money. That is true, that is correct. But the whole point here is the money saved isn't on a per nation basis. The money saved is on a 27 nation basis. And you're talking pretty phenomenal economies of scale here. So that is why the European Union is a regulatory superpower. It has all that intellectual muscle that it pulls into a centralised pot, and it uses them day in, day out to set regulations and to set standards. And to the rest of the world, perhaps not the UK, but the rest of the world, or the US, but the rest of the world, by and large, has recognised this. This is why many countries simply copy EU standards, and the EU is very happy for them to do so. They will make sure that there is alignment. And people who are familiar with the channel will know that I talk about alignment a lot because that is crucial for any negotiation. When you're conducting a negotiation, you need to understand how much you align or don't align with the proposal being put forward by the other side. Which brings me back more to the negotiation theme when dealing with European negotiators. The word I use very often on this channel is preparation. I talk about preparation a lot because that is crucial to all negotiations and is also by far the most common element of failure. So let's look at the issues I've talked about in terms of political and regulatory bureaucracy and kind of imagine how well prepared do you think an EU negotiator is. They will take a long time to get there. It'll be several months from deciding you're going to have a meeting to actually having a meeting. There will be a huge volume of paperwork of various studies, analysis, proposals, counter-proposals. And when they eventually turn up to the negotiation table, they will produce a document that is at least twice the size that any other country tends to produce. Another country that prepares or looks very similar in their preparation is the US. And the US is a superpower. So what both the Commission, EU Commission and the US government do is they leverage that massive bureaucracy with all its issues, with all its expenses, with all its weaknesses to help their negotiators prepare to a degree that is very difficult for any smaller nation to match. It's boring as hell, I'll be honest. You have to go through a huge amount of detail. But that again is their strength. They are on top of the detail because they spent so much time preparing. So when the EU or the US negotiators come to a negotiation, they can argue on any topic with significant conviction. And this is because part of the process of reaching the negotiation table, that bureaucracy had provided them with a huge amount of analytical power. And believe me, I don't use power, lightly. It is the correct word to use here. They have power through knowledge. They know that subject matter inside and out, or they bring the people who know that subject matter inside and out. They will have analysed all the pros and cons, and they will, to the best extent possible, know your strength and your weaknesses so that they can counter-argue against whichever proposals you wish to put forward. So what that means is that, like the US, the EU Commission has a considerable level of institutional power when it goes to any negotiation. So whilst it is very fashionable to criticise the EU and the US for their huge, slow, cumbersome and very annoying bureaucracy, the absolute reality that any negotiator knows is that when you're going up against that machine, you have to be on top of your game. You have to really know your stuff. You have to really do the preparation, because if you don't, those EU or American negotiators are going to very easily out-argue you and outmaneuver you at that negotiation table. So this particular weakness of the EU is perhaps not as much of a weakness as the critics of the EU might like to think. So let's look at the next most common criticism of the EU, and that is that the whole structure is very much a process of slow decision making. It is impossible to get anything done quickly in the EU because it's basically decision by committee with 27 nations. And of course, on certain issues, every single one of those nations has the right of veto. Now, this criticism is true. The EU can be very slow to make decisions or to reach consensus, to deal with problems. And this was particularly obvious, for example, during the migrant crisis many years ago, which started many years ago, I should say. It's obviously still going, when the various southern borders and eastern borders were having significant inflows of asylum seekers and migrants. The EU Commission was not able to develop a coherent and fast response to that crisis. And that has been the biggest issue that is levelled at the EU. How they approach the COVID vaccine in the early days, I've covered that in a previous video, done a good year ago actually, for anyone interested to dig in and find that. And in that I pointed out that part of the problem for the EU was that they approached that problem with a very German way of thinking, which is, you buy your slots on a production line and vaccines roll out. Unfortunately for them, that pedestrian thinking was not necessarily the most appropriate way of handling a particular crisis. So in terms of decision making, there are definite fundamental issues. However, we also have the contrast. And we can contrast all of that with what has happened this year, where the EU Commission has been surprisingly decisive when dealing with the Ukraine crisis, putting forward and implementing sanctions on a widespread scale against Russia. So that is a huge amount of work that they have done, and their reaction to the Ukraine crisis has been astonishingly decisive for such a large and complex organisation like the EU Commission. So I don't think we can really, write any particular hard and fast rules here when it comes to the EU decision making. They can make decisions fast if they want to. The question is, do they want to? So on this one, this is where I will talk about the differences between the adversarial style of political governance versus the collaborative, more consensual style. So adversarial, the UK and the US are good examples of political and legal adversarial systems. Basically, the politicians don't like to cooperate with each other, they shout each other down, and whoever takes power uses that power in a way to maximise their benefit and to absolutely minimise the influence of the other side. So, adversarial. The European approach is extremely different, and in fact this is reflected in the way that they negotiate as well, not just about their politics. Because European political construct is all about building consensus. You cannot run a modern European democracy, or very few of them anyway, solely with your own party, if you're the leader of a political party. Quite often you're in coalitions, or you need some kind of agreement with a wide range of other political parties and groups in order to be able to govern effectively. And you can see this approach very much represented, or reflected even, in how the EU actually works. So they may be very slow about their decision making, but that is because every major decision has to be run past all 27 nations. Now that sounds like a bit of a nightmare when trying to get anything done, and it kind of is. But it's also an advantage in a different way. Because the thing is about politics is that there's no true, or very few, truly right or wrong answers. If any particular policy was obviously and blindingly, sensible and had no drawbacks, then usually people would be doing it already. People try to overlook this part, but anything sensible would already be happening. So where governments and organisations like the EU operate is having to deal with stuff where the evidence is not necessarily always clear. Now, people familiar with this channel will be aware that I talk about, as part of the preparation stage for any negotiation, of subjecting yourself to a high level of scrutiny or constructive criticism. And this is because any experienced negotiator knows that if you get a little bit too embroiled in groupthink, you may think you've got a great idea, and that you're going to be proposing, a great thing, plan, whatever, to the other side. But if you've only ever subjected that idea to a narrow group of people, particularly a group of people who are not deep experts in particular intricate, complex aspects of that idea, then quite any of those failings will come back to get you at that negotiation. So as part of the preparation stage, you ask as many people within your organisation and even outside of the organisation to review your proposals to suggest any improvements. It's not necessarily an easy or a quick process, but what it is the collaborative style of preparing yourself. And by doing that, the end result should be a stronger product, a better product. That is how the Europeans operate politically. It is also how they operate in terms of negotiation. They spend a lot of time preparing and subjecting stuff to scrutiny. So that is how the EU Commission works. It is big government done the European way. Let's compare that a little bit to the US by interesting contrast. Because there should be a parallel. The US is a nation of 50 states. But the dynamics are completely different. Those 50 states do not really get to set federal government policy. They get very little input. So as a consequence, the US government may appear more decisive, but in reality, it is one political party that has dominance. And it's a political party that doesn't seek to obtain the consent of the other political party. So what you can end up with is a seesaw effect, where as election cycles come through and political parties change, the new political party will try and reverse what the previous one has done. It creates a great deal of inconsistency in politics. So when looking at the EU Commission by contrast, who adopt this more consensual collaborative approach, it's not enough to look at them and to say they are bad decision makers on any one individual issue. It is more important to look at the overall trend of consistent long-term decision making, because that is one of the biggest criticisms anyone can make of any adversarial political system. They're very bad at long-term planning, whereas a more consensual collaborative system is, in theory, doesn't always work, but in theory meant to be much better at implementing long-term decisions and plans. And this is crucial if you want to rule a bloc of 27 nations. I use the word rule very loosely there, because of course consistency is what people want. They want good decisions, and they want good decisions to be made regularly, not infrequently. We shall not talk about the UK system, which is incapable of making good decisions right now. But the EU Commission, the EU system, is not without its flaws. I don't think anyone should be under any illusions on that. But what does have to be recognised is that this collaborative approach has a few additional benefits. It gives smaller states more say in some of the politics that goes on, some of the decisions that are made. Imagine being Hawaii trying to tell the US federal government, what to do. It's not going to happen. While smaller countries in the EU, particularly Poland or Luxembourg or Belgium or whoever, they tend to have a disproportionate influence in the EU because they have the right of veto. So they're able to make their voices heard. And this does mean that whatever policy, whatever decision is made, generally everyone should buy into it. And buy-in is something I talk about a lot in negotiations. Anyone that goes into a negotiation without having first secured buy-in from their own side is immediately on a path to failure. Never mind trying to get buy-in from the other side. You've got to get your own house in order before you can argue your case with the opposition. And this is what the EU tries to do. Try to get all their arguments internally done, dusted, so when they eventually do come out into the light and present their decision, there is no argument. They will just get on with it. And this is a very German way of approaching things. The German system is very slow at making a decision. There's a lot of preparation, a lot of analytical work that goes on. But when they do decide, then they're extremely reliable at implementing that decision. Perhaps a little bit too reliable, perhaps a little bit too inflexible. But again, there's pros and cons either way that you look at it. And so when you're looking at the whole, politics and how democracy is done, consensual allows more people to have more of a say in decision making. This is in complete contrast to adversarial system, which deliberately does the opposite. So whilst it may seem frustrating how the EU goes about in its decision making, the reality is the good decisions are the ones you never hear about. So we talk about regulatory stuff, which is really boring. No one's interested in European regulatory systems and democracy and so on. But that is how modern economies function. No well-developed economy functions without significant regulations. Not even the US, and I know many people sort of hold up the US as a sort of bastion of free marketing. That is completely overlooking the fact that the US economy as a whole is the most regulated economy that you can possibly imagine. The number of laws they have is quite overwhelmingly phenomenal. That is because US lawmakers recognized a long time ago that making good regulatory decisions, and they don't always make good ones, but they do make decisions, is crucial to allow any decent economy to function. The EU has taken that idea, weaponized it, and made themselves a superpower with it. They make good decisions that people don't care about, but which are fundamental to the workings of any economy, particularly for a big, complex economic system like the single market. What the EU Commission struggles with when it comes to making big, high-profile decisions that people expect quick and over-easy answers to. And on that one, they are not quite so strong. But that is not to say that over the long term, they don't make better decisions rather than worse ones. And this is why you have to track how they operate over the long term and not on an individual decision basis. And so finally, I'll turn to the final most common argument. And this is one that's really made very frequently by people who honestly have no clue what they're talking about. So they talk about the EU not being democratic enough and representing them. And as is always with these things, there's an element of yes and no type responses. I'll start with a bit of the obvious stuff. Now, I've talked about the power of the EU as a regulatory superpower. The fact that they will create a market that would adhere to a set of common standards which drive through an awful lot of efficiency and benefit, albeit the process of getting there can be a bit costly on an individual basis, but represents a good value when spread across the bloc. So the sort of questions you've got to ask when someone says the EU doesn't represent them and doesn't take their views into account is, well, do you want to vote on what the regulations are for bananas or how much pollution a German engine can make? Do you really want that level of say? I would perhaps argue or guess that they don't. So how much democracy do they want really? Well, let's break this down slightly by comparing the EU democratic system with the UK to compare and contrast on a sort of a structural level. I'm not going to get this perfectly right. This is just going a little bit from memory from what I know, so don't take me to task on it, but hopefully I'll get it mostly right. When anyone in the UK used to vote for their EU representative, they pretty much had one vote. They voted their candidate via proportional representation, which is a modern democratic way of voting people. Those candidates then got put into the EU Parliament, and they then joined up with other like-minded political blocs to cast their votes in support of motions and legislation and so on and so forth, as pretty much any normal parliament does. So in that context, any UK citizen gets one vote into what happened at the Commission via their representative. Except that's not quite the end of the story, because in addition to that, the EU Commission is formed by representatives from each of the nations. So in this scenario, the UK government, elected by the UK electorate, then got to decide who was going to be the UK representative to be in the EU Commission. I'll circle back to that point later. And of course, you've got other systems where by appointment, UK judges, for example, can sit in the EU judicial system. And there is obviously UK were influential at all levels of the EU prior to exit. They may not be elected, but then arguably, do you want to get to the level of electing your ministers or electing your civil servants into any government system? Most people say they don't want to do that, so we'll park that. Look at the UK system. In the UK system, which is a first past the post adversarial system, you also get one vote, and one vote only. As a UK citizen, you vote for your MP, not the leader, not the party, although of course the MP represents the party, but you vote that one MP. That one MP can quite often win with less than 50% of the vote, because of course this is not a PR system. They can go to the House of Commons, and as a delegated representative with the mandate of your vote, they can do whatever they like for the next 5 years. They could vote to demolish your constituency. They could vote to make you poorer. They can vote against the government. They can vote new leaders. You as a UK citizen get no further say. Region, let's pretend Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that sort of region, they don't get to appoint ministers into the UK government. Your MP doesn't get a say in who becomes a minister in the cabinet of the government. Those who represent in the Lords are appointed, and the government will appoint various people. So really in the UK system, you have that one vote, and that one vote can be rendered meaningless if your MP decide to go their own path. There's no recall, there's no right that you have to stop that MP to decide that they're not representative of you. They don't really get to form the government. They may form part of it, or they may be in opposition. So when you stack these systems up against each other, the UK and the European system, I am not going to pretend that the EU system doesn't have flaws. But as a construct, it is already well ahead of the Westminster system. And this is what people have to remember about the UK democratic system. It is about as minimally democratic as you can be while still being a viable democracy. If it became any less democratic, the UK would cease to be a proper functioning democracy. And that is kind of how close things are in terms of construct. Now there is an issue, and the issue for the EU has always been the issue, which is voters in any country are voting for MEPs, but not necessarily feeling the connection between what their MEP does, what their representative in the EU Commission does, and what happened to them in their area, in their constituency. That is indeed a valid criticism of the EU democratic system. Unfortunately, it is a criticism that can be applied just as strongly in many contexts to many other systems as well, particularly the UK system. And you'll see plenty of those arguments made in Scotland when they're not even voting for anybody who formed the government in Westminster, yet have to abide with all the politics and the rules imposed upon them, which is of course going to be an interesting issue in the coming years. So the point is that the EU is a blend. Let's compare and contrast the US even. US citizens get far more votes. They vote a president. They vote a congressman. They vote a senator. They can vote their governors. So that's 4 alone that I've already thought of. I'm not even going to bother going into the whole other things they can vote for. There's quite a lot. So now there is an element of voter fatigue in the US system, but they get multiple votes for multiple individuals in multiple offices. The EU does not operate that way, and that is because they took the decision that to do so would be completely impractical. But what you have to remember is the US and the UK even, maybe in the future, have to operate that way because of the adversarial style of the system. The EU is a collaborative style, as most European governments is. So that means that a lot of the parties are working together. So even if you're not directly casting your vote for any particular policy or individual, you still have representation that is working to your interests. Now this could be a video all on its own, so I'm not going to delve too much further into that. But the point I want to make is that European democratic legitimacy is based upon the fact that most people consent to what they do on a group basis. And achieving consensus as a group is very hard to do and very much a core negotiation skill for anyone who is trying to be influential at a group negotiation. It's all about stakeholder management. It's all about identifying alignment and building up a common position. And that is what the EU does. It may not be sexy. It may not translate to clear-cut voting, but it does translate into certain outcomes. And if you look at the US system by contrast, they may get more voting, but they don't get clear-cut outcomes. So no system is perfect, but it has to be recognised that the EU system is not as undemocratic as some people like to pretend. So in concluding this video, these are the particular points that I thought I would make, which is that the EU has more strengths than weaknesses. The EU is far from perfect. No system is perfect. But I know that the EU negotiators are some of the best in the business. And they are that not because they are exceptional, charismatic type individuals. To be honest, they are pretty damn good, but because they have this whole system sitting behind them that has considerable power, considerable horsepower under the hood, shall we say, as Americans might say, to crunch through the numbers, crunch through all the facts, crunch through all the analysis, and obtain consensus that negotiator takes with them when they go to a negotiation. Now, is it always done in the interest of the entire bloc? Arguably not. And the best example we can see of that is the Greek debt crisis that happened nearly 10 years ago now. So in that scenario, the EU Commission, like any other political organisation, was dominated by the influence of France and Germany. So when the Greek debt crisis threatened the integrity of the euro and the European banking system, particularly in Germany and France, the EU Commission batted for French and German interests because they were the dominant interests. That is a reality in any political system. It is the EU perhaps better than most, and that more often than not the smaller states can band together to exert more influence, and this is an argument that is coming to the fore with Poland and the possibility of, for example, of Ukraine joining the EU. That would shift the balance of power away from France and Germany. So this is a hot political topic in the EU. But the point is that the EU, like any other political organisation, will move to protect itself. And if that means it has to squash lesser countries or lesser organisations to do so, then like any other political group, that is exactly what they would do. The break, if you like, is that they have to build more consensus to doing so. So we compare that to the US system, for example. The US government can go and squash anyone that they like, and there's a very limited break on them, in many cases, exerted by Congress or the Senate or even the Supreme Court. That is sort of domestically. Internationally, probably all bets are off, I suspect, because the US government has a lot of primacy when it comes to international affairs. The EU, by contrast, has very little primacy on international affairs, but does retain a little bit more on domestic affairs, and that's because of their role in managing the single market and all the regulations and so on that goes into that. So it gives the EU a considerable level of strength that they have that inbuilt protection system, that survival instincts, as it were, and that they have that ability to obtain consensus for whatever action they need to pursue. So, as a consequence of all of that, the EU has considerably more democratic legitimacy, and perhaps people just look at it on paper think. The EU gets a lot done in its slow and ponderous way because 27 nations agree for it to get work done. No other body really has that level of democratic legitimacy, notwithstanding the whole voting of representatives into Parliament type business. So that gives them a lot of power. That gives them a lot of ability to influence events, and they use that very much in support of European interests. And the final and very particular point I want to make, and this is particularly perhaps relevant to those in the UK and the US to think about this deeply, is that the construct of the EU system is that it's very hard for any single group to dominate. I've talked about French and German interests dominating how the EU Commission works, but they still cannot have full dominance because even then, quite often the representatives may not be aligned with the people in government. So when we saw that a lot in the UK, MEPs from the UK were not all that often from the ruling government party. So that acts like a brake, if you like, on anything that the UK might think they can do. So they have to form groups. And it's very hard for any individual party to dominate to the extent that they can do anything that they like. Now, there's arguments always made for that it strengthens their ability to be decisive and so on. But it also always runs the risk of them being able to act like autocracies. And we're seeing this increasingly in the UK and US political systems. Those parties do not want to compromise. They do not want to act in the interests of the general public or the state at large, and they do not want to work collaboratively, to compromise, to try and make good decisions. They're far more interested in making their own partisan, sectoral type decisions. The EU, by contrast, has an inbuilt structural barrier to that sort of system. It is not perfect. There is no such thing as perfect. And even if you take the view that the EU political system is a bad one, the easiest counter-argument to that is that it is far better for any democracy to have two bad democratic systems fighting each other than to be ruled by one bad democratic system that has no checks or brakes on what it can do to you. And that is something I think that those who support Brexit in the UK perhaps wish to ponder when the conversation, as it inevitably must in the next few years, will move to the issue of democratic and electoral reform in the UK. Because there is no way you can have a better democracy in the UK by having just removed the element of the checks and balance that used to exist without replacing them. And right now the UK political system, as is the US, is not at all interested in replacing an all the dysfunctional and bad system. So, does that mean the EU will become a dystopian nightmare? Or is that perhaps a description better applied to the UK and the US. I leave that to you to debate. So thank you very much for listening to this video. I hope you found it interesting and challenging. Please do like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing some of the comments and debates in the comments box below.